Welcome to the Season 4 of the India Energy Hour podcast. This podcast explores the most pressing hurdles and promising opportunities of India's energy transition through an in-depth discussion on policies, financial markets, social movements and science. Your host for this episode is Dr. Sandeep Pai, Washington-based energy transition researcher and author. The show is produced by 101 Reporters, a pan-India network of grassroots reporters that produces original stories from rural India. India has made significant progress in enhancing access to modern fuels through policies that support greater use of LPG cylinders. However, several issues still remain. Nearly 2.8 billion people around the world depend on solid fuels such as firewood and biomass for their cooking needs. Majority of such people reside in African and Asian countries, including in India. To understand the Indian clean cooking challenge and the required interventions, we interviewed Abhishek Kar, Senior Program Lead at the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. Abhishek have led numerous studies on energy access in India and in other countries, and is a known expert in this area.
Hi Abhishek, welcome to the India Energy Hour podcast. Yeah, it's really like nostalgic for me because um, we studied in the same university, in the same department, with the same supervisor, in the same lab. So it's really nostalgic, and it almost feels like this would be a very friendly conversation. But I have seen your work throughout the years, so I'm really excited to learn about clean cooking and related energy transition issues in India and globally. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me here. Finally, a podcast which I have been listening to pretty carefully over the many years. It's great to be here finally.
So just Abhishek, what before we talk about this really interesting topic of energy access, especially with respect to clean cooking, why don't we start with your story? Like, where are you from? What did you study? I think I know some of this, but I'm also curious. You always learn something new when you ask even your oldest friend, like, what is your life story and how did you get into this space?
Right. So what happened was that after when I was in my masters, doing my masters in physics, in Calcutta, from Presidency College that time, now it's university. Like I was associated with an NGO, and at that point of time, I was a very normal urban middle class boy growing up, and that time I kind of had an exposure to stuff which was kind of odd for me. Like I remember in one of the visits, I went to one of the islands in Sundarban, and there we saw that people had a solar cook stove, but they never used that, and they used part of the mirror, you know, part of the glass uh, as a mirror. And that was something that for me was something okay. Like there's a nice technology. People have been given a technology. Why are they not using it? And that kind of really interested me and my curiosity in this space that what happens and why do people not behave as they should behave. For me, that was like the normative thing. That if people are given a technology which is a useful technology, use it. And what has happened is that when I kind of asked around, a couple of professors told me that this is not a science problem, it is a management problem. And that really made me very curious about the management side of it. And rural energy access is a very niche field. And it was far more niche in 2004-5 when I kind of first encountered this incident. And there were like literally two institutes in the entire country where I heard that they are like good institutes and they do work on rural areas. So if you end up there, you will learn something. But the people I spoke about, they really didn't know much in terms of whether energy access is kind of an important subject there or not. One was Irma, in Anand, and one was Indian Institute of Forest Management. I applied to both the places. In one, I didn't even get shortlisted. In the other, I got through. And while being there, I think I had a lot of field trips. We had a lot of field trips in at IFM, and where I kind of found, okay, it's not just a problem with the solar stove. There are a bunch of technologies where you have same problems, and there are some cases where there are perhaps obvious solutions, but either they're not being implemented, or even when implemented, they're not being used. And that really kind of has been my wonderland kind, that how do you get people to use technologies which are good? And again, now I before I do which is good for them, now I do not use the word good for them, but which I say which I think will be good for them. So I kind of put in that modifier after 16, 17 years of running around in the field and understanding that what I think is good may not be the good which they think from their perspective.
Right. You kind of started off from your time at masters and all, but like let's go back even further. Right? Where were you? Like, where did you grow up? I'm not sure even I know this. But like, where did you grow up? What did you do? Like,
Okay.
how did you even
So,
get to the
I
stage
grew
of
up in
masters? And then, yeah,
okay. Okay. So so I grew up in Kolkata, and I studied in St. Paul's boarding and day school. Now it's a girls' school because they got so you know upset with the boys doing whatever boys do, that they said, okay, let's move it to a girls' school now. And my daughter still taunts me over that. So, and then I kind of did my. So I was never really interested to be a doctor or engineer, and thankfully, my parents never were. Like though it's in a typical middle class Bengali family, it will be like like why you don't want to be a doctor. My parents were like, okay, what do you want to do? I said I want to study physics. They said, okay, go ahead and study physics. So I was very lucky that my parents always found that I was a pretty average or below average student. That's why they never had really an expectation from me. And I'm being very truthful and candid. I was throughout a pretty kind of the bottom 25% of the class, almost entirely until class 10. So my parents said, "Acha, chalo, if this guy like passes and does not clears everything without flunking, I think that's good enough standard for me." So I really never had that push that you have to sit for engineering JEE, as we call that, joint entrance exam. Uh, so I was like very happy go lucky in terms of like doing whatever I could do. And even in physics it kind of really interested me, because that is one topic where you don't have to memorize much. And that's the reason why I hated chemistry and biology, because there is so much to do. So I was always kind of like least possible study what subject can be cracked through that. And one thing I found was, once you are conceptually good in physics, you can derive most of the stuff. So that's why I chose physics as a subject. And then, of course, once you complete your graduation, then what should I do? Again, I never had this fascination for the typical government jobs or bank jobs, which again, bunch of my friends were like really kind of focused upon. I was like, okay, let me do something, and okay, let me go to presidency and study some physics, and then we'll figure out what happens next. And what happens next was management. Moving to management was something that was not expected at all from to be frank. Like even in my last year of college, I would not have probably thought that, okay, in 2 years I'll be sitting in a management institute.
okay, great. And so from basically from physics to management, and then you had all these field trips, and then from that field trip you were inspired, and then you were like, this is a great topic, let me get into it. And then I think after that, you know,
Yes, yes. So I did my internship at West Bengal Renewable Energy Development Agency, and there was this Dr. S.P. Gonchodhary was there at that time, and heading WB Radar, and he was a phenomenal personality. And the thing that really struck me was how patient he was, because I blurted out stuff to him, which if someone tells me today, I like are you insane? But he was like so patient and he said, great idea, So I always remember, like like when I went to field trips there, and I really went to the deep interior villages in Sundarban. I saw one of the first ever solar power plants that was put in, which was inaugurated by Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam. And those places, the challenges that I found in terms of, okay, you put in a technology, there's inauguration, everyone goes back home happy. Next day onwards, if there is a problem, if the wire malfunctions, what happens? Who comes in? Who saves you? Who repairs the stuff? So I think that internship with WB Data, while of course I got a report and everything out of that, but I think more importantly, what it gave me is really opened my eyes in terms of what challenges are when you're doing something on the field by a government agency. So and this is something that I found resonance throughout my career. We always have found great motivated officials trying to do something, and then there is a bunch of system in place which either you know deletes in like which either delays the work or which just intentionally or unintentionally creates a stumbling block. And so things that we intend to when we start a project or start something on the field, it almost rarely does it fully materialize.
Right. So I just want to quickly turn to one last thing, and I know that after that you went and worked with Terry, and then you did a PhD on this topic. So if you want to quickly just finish the circle, and now you're at CEW, then we can just move on to the topic. But just to see your career trajectory would be an interesting one.
Right. So after IFM, like my first internship in WB Red, as I told, my second internship, we had two internships those days, was at Terry, and Terry was like kind of a really great space for me there because we had a bunch of people, very multidisciplinary, and a very kind of a what I'll say is very experienced lot of people, at least in the department where I had worked at that point of time, under Dr. Hafizur Rahman, where people did a lot of field. So I had been working with people with 10 years, 15 years, 20 years of field expertise, and the insights which I always got from them amazed me because those insights were not really ever captured in the textbooks or in the research papers which we read. So that is why even now I tell my colleagues that you need to really spend time in the field to develop an understanding of what works and what doesn't work before you kind of progress in your career and starts formulating and advising on what works and what doesn't work. So after Terry, after 7.5 years in Terry, I moved to UBC under Hisham. Hisham's, if I remember, Hisham coming to and even in IFM, I was like a pretty average student. So I remember I met Hisham for the first time in Delhi, in one of, and I was like prepared with some of the questions, some of the for a pre-PhD kind of an interview chat, I was like thinking, okay, what kind of stats question he's going to ask me and all. And his first statement was, it's not even the question, was like Vancouver is a great place to raise kids. I'm like, wow, like that is an empathy, like which you don't see because he knew I had one child at that point of time. So I was like, okay, and like very rarely you will find that, but I actually just applied to one university, and that was UBC, and nowhere else in the world. So, and by the grace of God, I got in there, and then I met you.
Okay, great. And then you did some really cool studies during your PhD. So let's just, in the interest of time, let's just go into the topic. So let's just start by understanding what do we mean by clean cooking, right? Like we have, like, are we talking about LPG? Are we talking about solar cooking? Like, what does the clean cooking even mean? Let's just start with that, and then I want to understand what's the global scenario of clean cooking and where does world and countries stand in terms of clean cooking.
Right. So, what is clean cooking is actually a kind of a contested question, interestingly, in this space. And this space is full of, engineers, public health professionals, NGOs. So, one definition which I am most aligned with is one that is used by the World Health Organization, which is BLEANS, BLEENS, which is like B stands for biogas, L stands for LPG or liquefied petroleum gas, E stands for electricity, the second E stands for ethanol, the N stands for natural gas, and the S stands for solar. So beams are group of technologies out of the many other technologies that is there. It's a subset of the so-called clean cooking solutions, which whose impact on human health is significantly lower than that of firewood burning. Like because the clean cooking problem is that people, burn firewood, crop residue, or cattle dung in polluting ancient design stoves. So these six technologies are understood to have significantly lower emissions compared to those the baseline of polluting stoves. And while there is significant studies which can say, okay, like LPG still has harmful emissions. But if you look at the comparison between the firewood versus LPG, you still see significantly better. Of course, if you have to think of zero emission solutions, which is like solar, like or electric stoves, where there is no uh, firewood, where there is no emission per se or your pollutants. And when you think about the clean cooking, the of what is the scale of the problem. Now one challenge has been that how do you define the problem, because there can be a household which has one of these blends technology, and they also have a mud stove, and an example of that can be India, where given the phenomenal work uh, by the government in terms of promoting LPG under the Pradhan Mantri Ujjwala Yojana, we have almost a near saturation of LPG in any rural household. So they will have an LPG, but they will also have a mud stove where they burn firewood. So how do you define whether a household is using clean cooking or not? And one typical way people do it in surveys is that they ask, "What is your main cooking fuel?" or "What is your primary cooking fuel?" Sorry, and the word primary is kind of a tricky one here, because people may take it in many ways interpret, but given assuming that that you are getting a reasonable estimate of what people mean by the primary clean cooking fuel, we'll see that about 2.4 billion to 2.6 billion people still are primarily dependent on firewood and solid biofuels. And that is the challenge of household air pollution. And it's not just a household air pollution problem. In India, about 33% of the ambient air pollution's emission contribution for PM 2.5 comes from household air pollution. So if you can make all households in India transition completely to a clean cooking fuel, your overall emissions, PM 2.5 emissions from India is going to reduce by one third. So it has a significant, impact not only for the households that are forced to continue using the solid fuels, but also people who are kind of, you can see in some ways, detached from the problem because they are sitting in urban areas and they can afford the clean cooking solutions. But even they're suffering because the emissions from those kitchens are coming and they're mixing well in the atmosphere, and they are contributing to ambient air
Right.
pollution.
So I'm just like, when you think about like 2.5 billion out of like 8 odd billion, like that's like almost one third of humanity that is using, so-called non-clean cooking fuel. I mean, that the scale of problem seems huge globally. Where is this problem? Is this in countries like India? Is it in Africa? Can you paint a picture of?
Right. While they use this kind of a nice term called the global south, that most of this problem is in the global south, but there is still a difference, where the word global south sometimes masks the variation within. Say, for example, in Latin America and the Caribbean, the number of the percentage of households who depend on clean cooking is about 56%, which is like a very decent amount. So more than half the population are using clean cooking as their primary or as their exclusive cooking fuel. If you think of sub-Saharan Africa, that 56% goes down to 10%. India and and the neighboring countries in South Asia, we are about at 27%. Where 27% of the households in South Asia are dependent on clean cooking fuels primarily. And again, as I said, it's a very tricky thing on what are clean cooking solutions and how you're defining the dependence on clean cooking
Right.
solutions.
Let me ask you.
So it's a complex problem with a different baseline you're working with. In Latin America, the market is much more advanced. The economies are in a better position. In Asia, it is South Asia is like somewhere in the middle, and in Sub-Saharan Africa, things are seriously concerning. And unfortunately, in the last 20-30 years, the absolute number of people who are dependent on polluting fuels has increased in Sub-Saharan Africa, and that's a risk.
Okay, let me ask you a proactive question. I mean, you mentioned a range of technologies that included natural gas, LPG, and others as well. I mean, in a climate constrained world, why are we promoting non-renewable sources? Yes, they may have less impact, but why are we promoting these sources when the goal should be, fully electric based on renewables? At least that's what many people in the world would argue. So what do you have to say about that?
Right. So I think there are three parts answers to it. The first one is the moral answer, which is like given that every year because of household air pollution, we have an estimated deaths of about 3.2 million people every year. That is the latest WHO estimate, which is the date for 2020, including about 200, more than 200,000 children under the age of 5 is attributed to household pollution. So, given that, the focus should be on any technology which helps reduce this immediately. And LPG has widely been considered as one of the most scalable solutions, given the existing electricity scenario and given how convenient it is for people to often to transition to a mature technology like LPG. The second answer is a more technical answer, and here's the interesting one. Though LPG is a fossil fuel, studies have shown, and these are like published peer-reviewed studies, including one of the studies which I have recently co-authored with another research organization based out of India, CSIR NEED, based out of Nagpur, where we show that given that the firewood that is used for cooking is often unsustainably harvested, transition from firewood to LPG is actually a net gain for the climate. So so imagine this that the while biomass is technically a renewable resource, it is renewable only if it is sustainably harvested and used for cooking. But it is often unsustainably harvested. The numbers globally is about 30%. For India, it's about 23%. The 23% of all firewood used for cooking in India is unsustainably harvested. And if you think of, and there are a bunch of calculations, I'll not bore you with that, but like um, the audience can look up and see that studies after studies have shown that given in many countries in South Asia, in Sub-Saharan Africa, transition from solid polluting fuels to even a fossil fuel like LPG is a net climate benefit. And I think this is one takeaway miss which I really want your audience to go back after hearing this podcast.
Wow, that's really fascinating. But let me kind of double click on one point. You talked about mature technology, and LPG, seems like a mature technology in this case. But talk to me about the price points here. right? If I were a villager in India, and again, it may depend on geography, who wants to use solar based or renewable based, cook stove, versus I want, if I mean, you remove all the subsidies. Let's just remove all the subsidies, but like on a you know on the basis of comparison between like a solar cooking and a LPG cooking, which is more expensive? Like, if solar is more expensive or solar is less expensive, like, can you talk about why the other has not diffused as well?
Right. So I think there are two parts of it. One is the technological acceptability and the ability of a technology to adapt to the local cooking needs. Because what happens is in a solar, say the traditional solar cooker, of course there are some newer versions coming in, but the traditional solar cookers have been used for decades now. That is the one which I first met many years back. So what happens there is the because it did not have a battery, that particular system, even when the sun was at its peak, say around 12 o'clock, 1 o'clock, 2 p.m., that is the time when the cooker used to be ready for cooking food. And the target audience for this cook stove are poor people in rural India who often are not at home at that time because in the early morning they leave for the fields and they come back in the evening. So there was this disconnect between what people want in terms of a convenient, safe technology in the morning and evening versus what was provided. LPG in that way is a very versatile. It can very quickly get fired and ignition happens, and often even say guests come in, you need to quickly make tea. It's a really a good technology per se. That's why like many years back, one of the gurus in this field, Kirk Smith, he was in the field, and he said that while we are talking about so many different technologies, we never found that people not disliking LPG. The challenge becomes when you have to pay for LPG because, as you have rightly pointed out, it's an expensive thing. And it's expensive not just for the households, it's also expensive for the government. You have to understand that in 2023, about 65% of LPG that has been used for domestic LPG has been imported. And given the global LPG price volatility, given the foreign exchange currency volatility, it is very difficult for to expect a developing economy like India, and especially if you think of the sub-Saharan Africa, that is where I think the attention of the entire industry should be now. You will find this persistent problem of the government is not really in a position to subsidize it much beyond something. And so many countries in Africa they do not provide any subsidy because they say that once we start using subsidy, it is like a path we don't want to trade upon because there will be more and more demands for subsidy, and then our economy, which is already kind of scraping by in terms of fiscal deficit, will just not be able to manage it. So it now boils down to the household. And for the household, it is not just issue of price, Sandeep. I think this is something which I kind of keep talking about. It is while price of course matters. If you think of the bottom of the pyramid model, of course there will be this bottom 10%, 20%, 30% population for whom the price of LPG, even the subsidized LPG, is now about rupees 700. INR in India, going to be a challenge. But for many other households which are still not using LPG completely, it is an issue of value for them. Do they find value in the product? Is there an opportunity cost for 700 rupees? And of course, while there is on one side we can talk, yes, there are services and products where you have to pay and there is no free alternative. Here there is actually a non-monetized alternative. And that alternative is um, free by firewood. You just walk a little bit to the nearest forest or the farmland. You can get the wood and you can burn it. Many people have crops, and after the post-harvest season, there are stacks and stacks of arhar ki dal in UP. What will they do? Will they throw it in a scarcity mindset in our country? It is very difficult for a household to throw something where there is a utility of that. So there's always this question is there, yes, maybe I can, if I try hard, I can shell out this 700 rupees. But can I use this money for better things? And sometimes the better things are really good things like health and education. Sometimes it is also vice, good car, tobacco, and studies have shown that the expenses on those are kind of, maybe the half the monthly cost of LPG cylinder if someone is using LPG fully. So, so there is a tricky thing of not the cost but the value for money of the LPG, and I think that is where there is a significant challenge to be met. Studies after studies have shown if you give LPG free of cost, there is almost no problem in adoption. People happily adopt it, and like the study by uh, Ajay Pilisarti has shown in Pune with pregnant women, they were provided LPG stoves for free, and there's no issues of culture, taste, food, everyone happily uses it. LPG, I'll say, is kind of the gold standard for many people in rural India, but in a patriarchal society where often the male member is the decision maker regarding budget, there is always this tension around is LPG value for money?
Fascinating. Abhishek, I have so many questions that were popping, but just one last question on this kind of solar versus LPG comparison. Is the capital cost, the initial cost of a solar, the best system that is available in the market right now? Like, with battery or whatever. How does that compare?
Right. So the government, in fact, the prime minister last year in 2023 February had announced that the Indian Oil Corporation they have launched a new solar proof stove called Surya Newton, and it's a very nice stove, with gadgets and everything. But the cost of that is about 50,000, 60,000, 70,000 rupees per system. And the challenge here is that there are many. It has its application, I would say, because the government does want to scale up solar stoves, significantly. But the challenge is that upfront capital cost has to be covered by someone, and this upfront capital cost has been a challenge not just for solar but also for fantastic technology like biogas. Again, there are sectoral applications in a village where most people are cattle owners. Biogas can be a great solution. In very remote areas where government already spending significant amount of money, the oil marketing companies, by just transporting the LPG from the plains up in the mountains, say in Ladakh, or to the islands, say in Lakshadweep, or in the northeast. In those places, the cost of delivering the LPG cylinder is not really recovered from the consumers. So the government is paying out of it. And maybe if you do that estimation of the cost, maybe in 3, 4 years, that money that you're saving up on the delivery cost, maybe it makes this huge capital cost as something that is, where it pays off in itself. But the only trick here is you have to prove that this technology can function smoothly for 5 to 10 years. And that is where I think more pilots and more data is necessary to convince that this is a mature technology. That's why I kind of use the word mature technology. LPG has a 3 decade track record of being a safe technology where most of the dishes which people want to cook, they cook. And the proof of that is in studies where people were given LPG free of cost, they happily migrated to it, and except maybe one or two things where they still kind of went back to the traditional stove, they use the LPG happily. So LPG in that way is a stable, mature technology with a good post-sales service infrastructure, which of course has been a subsidized initiative. The government over years has invested crores and crores of money to kind of develop a robust network of 25,000 distributors, LPG distributors, which is the last mile agents. Gi- Compared to that scalable technology, we still do not, we can have some niche products like biogas for places where, we have lot of uh, cattle owners. We can have PNG in concentrated urban, sectors, and the government has actually got a very ambitious program. They're almost at, I think, 1.2 crores of PNG connection, pipe natural gas, And the government's aim is by 2032 to move to almost 12 crore households. Out of in 2032, I think the India's households will be about 33 crores. Out of that, one third they plan to do via PNG and the rest via LPG. So LPG will be kind of a mainstay, but is there is a need for us to focus on other technologies. One technology which you did not mention is electric induction stoves, because induction is kind of an important thing, and at least in urban and peri-urban areas, companies are reporting significant increase in interest on electric induction. But the question will always remain that for the rural areas, the target area are the rural poor in some ways, who are not using solid fuels and they have an LPG at their home. If all households start using LPG, and often the cooking period is the same time, because people come back from from a village, a group of 20 women are coming back from the field, and they are all going to go back to their home and start cooking. The peak load, which will come from electric induction, can the grid survive that? Especially the distribution infrastructure that has been developed not for induction, not for 1,000 watt induction stove, but for a 20-watt fan and a 5 watt, 10-watt LED lights. And while there are again, uh, while there are mixed views about it, I think there is a need to actually do this kind of pilots where we give a cluster of villages, everyone in induction stove, and we say use it in the evening as you cook, and then see what's the impact is on the grid. But doing this at a national scale out of nowhere can be risky.
Well, fascinating. Thank you. So, I mean, I'm just from this segment, if I can conclude, and please correct me if I'm wrong, like LPG is on the driver's seat, but we do need all the above here, in terms of like kind of moving the and clean cooking access. So, let's just double down on one topic, which I think you worked a lot on and has been India's very flagship program since the NDA government came to power in 2014. Let's talk about Ujwala and like tell us about what is Ujwala, what does it do, like what is Ujwala 1 versus Ujwala 2 and all the different pieces.
Right. So when Ujjwala came in 2016, like I say the audience has always been, the government has been very laser focused. It should be poor women. And the definition of poor initially was, there was this census that happened, socioeconomic census in 2011. They said everyone who has been categorized poor, they are based on certain uh, indicators that whether people had certain thing or they did not have. They kind of created this list of poor people. But to the government's credit, I'll say, as the program progressed, and initially, initially they thought it will, okay, we'll go to maybe 1 crore households or 2 crore households. But as they moved on, and now they are at 10 crore households, and most of that, almost 8 9 crore, they did in just 4 5 years, which was a phenomenal achievement given the scale which you're talking about. But the government was like, okay, let's make it as inclusive as possible. And at this point of time, I'll say, given the flexibility in the in the in the process of application and selection, almost anyone who is poor now and needs the LPG connection, they can just go with their Aadhaar card and get an LPG connection. The woman can go in and get an LPG. So it is. So while initially the selection criteria was more restrictive, your name has to be there as part of that particular list, and that didn't work out because, again, what you plan sitting in Delhi or one of the state capitals, and when you actually go to the field, you see difference. The person whose name was there in 2011 list may have died. The new Bahu has come in who just got married and she's not listed in that. And if she has to be the person who has to go and get it, how do they put her in there? So in a very practical challenge, I think, but the government always, I think the remarkable thing about Ujjwala's success, I'll say, has been that the government always had its gr- ear to the ground, And as soon as they saw the challenges coming in after interacting with the field officials and the distributors, they immediately made amendments in the process. So as and when the program grew and it became bigger and bigger, I think they were able to adapt to the lessons learned from the ground, and they made it more. What should I'm forgetting the right word. They made it more. Help me with this, Sandeep. You know, they made it
Do you,
more user friendly, if I may use the word. Yeah,
right. So again,
they made it more responsive. They made so they made it more responsive to the ground realities.
okay, great. So let me just, before we kind of talk about how Ujwala has operated, which you did a bit, I just want to understand what is Ujwala? Like, what does it do? So, is it a scheme that government subsidizes? Like, you know, explain it to somebody who doesn't know anything about Ujwala. You're on mute. You're on mute.
Okay. So what the PMEY program does is that the capital cost before the program came in, anyone who has to go for say buy cylinder, they have to give a security deposit, and they have to purchase a cylinder, they have to purchase a stove accessories, and the cost of that after you accumulate for security deposits and everything used to go to above more than rupees, about 3,000 rupees, let's say, take a ballpark number. What the government did was they waived off the security deposit. They worked closely with the manufacturers to reduce the cost of the stoves, and they made the entire application process a very seamless process as long as you have an Aadhaar card and a bank account, because the digital infrastructure by that time was ready. So PMA program can't just be transported anywhere, because the back end of the digital infrastructure in terms of the government knowing who is the beneficiary with the Aadhaar card, if they have to subsidize it, the link it to the bank account and the mobile phone number. So that system was ready, and the government kind of leveraged that system to roll out this program where they made it's easy that the security deposit was waived off, the price of the stove and the cylinder reduced, and the stove and the cylinder first time was given to them on a loan basis. So they said, okay, if the cost of the cylinder that time was say 500, 600 rupees, the cost of the stove was about 1,000 rupees. This is a 1,500 worth of stuff which you take, you use, and then we'll be withholding your subsidy every month as you whenever you purchase a LPG cylinder. Some money used to go back to your, so you have to upfront pay the full cost, and then in your linked bank account the subsidy money will be deposited. And they said that we will not give you the subsidy deposit till the cost of the stove and the first cylinder is recovered, which made a lot of sense, because then you are a household literally with showing an Aadhaar card is getting a shiny new stove, the first cylinder. They're using it happily, and then the hope is that they're going to go back to the distributor and purchase the refill. When they purchase the refill, the subsidy cost, the subsidy that was supposed to come back to their account will not come in till the cost of the capital cost, the loan that is there, that is waived off. That that is repaid, complete, fully repaid. So that was the system by which Ujjwala came in. But I think beyond just supporting the households and it's a scheme, it really became a big thing. It was, I think, one of the flagship programs of the government in many ways, where there's extensive awareness generation and door-to-door campaigns telling people that, okay, we have come to a village, there's a village camp, just get your Aadhaar card and documents and take a new stove, take a new cylinder. And I think that really helped in the transition process, because if you are, because there will be many households I can imagine, even if something is free of cost, the fact that you have to go to a far off place and then you have to wait, you may or may not get, there are a lot of uncertainties, so people would have maybe avoided it. But given the extensive branding, awareness generation, and these door to door campaigns that happened, it really helped. The government also did something called the Ujjwala Panchayat, where the women in the village. They share their experiences, some positive, some negative, some challenges on how they convince their husband on buying refills. So there was kind of a mass movement, I'll say, in this space where everyone knew about LPG. Everyone, everywhere, from a petrol pump to a school, you saw the word Ujjwala written in the local language, and the distributors really kind of made the service excellent. Of course, in a country like India, you will always find few incidents here and there where things are not ideal or optimal. But again, if you think of it on the whole, given what given the scale of the program, I think it has by all accounts been a marvelous governance achievement.
Okay, that's really great. Can you talk to me about what is the difference between Ujjwala 1 and Ujjwala 2? Like what tweaks happen?
So Ujjwala 2 only made it much easier for people who were left out in Ujjwala 1 to be part of it. So the program has remained exactly the same since 2016. Nothing has changed except the government made the eligibility easier and easier so that anyone who is left out now can just go in and get a new connection. The the other thing that's happened is the subsidy for Ujjwala, it was until recently about rupees 200. Recently, they made it to rupees 300, the subsidy. So, Ujjwala customers have always got slightly more subsidy than the general customers.
Very interesting. Thank you for explaining the global picture, the India story, then Ujjwala, which is the flagship scheme. Let's talk about the future. Where do we go from here? Right? Like that to me is a really interesting question. So we have reached, India has made large strides in terms of energy access, but from your own work that I have interacted with and with others, um, what I what to me seems like a bigger question of people: will people go back and refill, or will they slide back to what they were doing previously? Talk to me about this challenge. If you were given the advisory role in the government and you could directly advise to design something so people don't slide back, or we really double down on this, what are the few things that need to happen in the next 5 7 years?
Right. This is a great question and a kind of a difficult question to answer. So, let me try it in this way. What I would go for is a clean stack with something as the main cooking fuel. For example, in urban areas, in many places, even in Delhi, there will be slums where use of LPG is very limited and people still depend on purchasing firewood and burning. So there, for urban areas, I would go for a PNG plus approach, which is you try to provide people piped natural gas. There will be sometimes challenges in terms of people not paying up and the supply getting stopped. So you also provide them with a clean cook. So people already have LPG. So so maybe LPG as a backup for urban areas and PNG as the mainstay. And this is for like countries with a mature market like India. For rural India, it can be an LPG plus approach where people have LPG as the primary cooking fuel, but there will be times when they don't have someone to go and provide a refill. There may not be home delivery of the refill. They may not have money to buy the refill. And there, if you provide an say improved biomass cook stove, which is really not part of blaze, but I always say something is better than nothing. Like perfect should not be an enemy of the good. So if someone has an LPG stove but has no money, so their only option is to go back to a polluting stove design and mud stove and put in the fire, put in the wood and burn the wood. Can we give them a technology where they're burning the wood, which is free of cost, but it will at least provide some incremental improvement in both combustion efficiency and thermal efficiency, which will reduce the smoke and reduce the quantum of wood that is being used. For countries, say in many places in sub-Saharan Africa, where there is almost no clean cooking infrastructure, and there are countries, where 70-80% of the households do not have access to clean cooking fuel. There, I think it will be A trickier question for urban areas, if there is a reasonable supply, I'll always say go for LPG or PNG. In places where there is a great grid infrastructure, electric grid, induction stove, absolutely a great option. But again, there will be a few clusters where the service is reliable enough and the distribution infrastructure is good enough to sustain the load that will come from an electric induction stove. Again, in places with good electricity availability, electric induction plus approach. So one mainstay clean fuel from the bleens plus something as a backup. And if it is two bleens product, one primary, one secondary, great. But I can live with one primary bleens and one secondary non-bleens, but it relatively better than the traditional uh, fuel.
Fantastic. That's really good. I have one last question, which is like, you have been observing India and India's clean cooking for a long time now. Both you've been in academia, you've been, out of academia, you've done work on the field. You've also done this work in other parts of the world and are quite familiar with other parts. If you can tell me what are some things world can learn from India's energy access, especially clean cooking experiment and diffusion, and what world can learn, like, so both ways, what India can learn and what other countries can learn from India. So if there are any things that you think peers can learn.
Right. So, say for example, in India, even a mid-level official in one of the oil marketing companies can just open a computer and say, okay, yesterday in this particular district, this particular village, there's an LPG distributor, he sold this many cylinders. In many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, it is like an absolute dream. They can only dream of such a digital information system, which the oil marketing companies have now developed and scaled up, and it's now completely automated, the entire data flow system that is linked to the invoicing. So if you have to make good policy, you need to have good data. That whether if you're say you have the data and you do a pilot project in a particular district or a particular state and say, okay, I have increased the subsidy from 300 rupees to 600 rupees. What has been the impact on sales? You can get literally real-time information. You can compare it with past years to analyze that what the impact has been. You just can't do that in many countries. The second thing is, I think some of the challenges that are there in African context are also there in Indian context. So some of the research that has been done in those settings should be thought about for India. For example, I recently published a paper where we did an analysis of LPG users in Ghana, and uh, we kind of bucketed the people into people who do not have LPG, people who use LPG but only occasionally, so like non-primary LPG use, people who use LPG as a primary cooking fuel, and people who exclusively or near exclusively use LPG. And what we found was something very striking. We looked into like 13 factors which is commonly discussed in the literature, in the clean cooking, in the academic literature on cooking and the transition. And we said, okay, which of these factors are associated if you think of someone moving from one stage to another stage? And what we found was that there are out of only two factors out of the 13 factors which are influential across all the three stages. So even something like wealth, which kind of is a no-brainer, if people have more money, they're going to transition to from no LPG use to non-primary to primary to exclusive. What we found was no, that was not the case. While wealth was very important for people to adopt LPG and move to primary, for movement from primary to exclusive was not really linked to wealth. Similarly, what we found was that so the studies that is happening, so I think there's a need for the south south cooperation and the south south learning from each other, where efforts and initiatives that where which we have learned from places like, say, Ghana, how can that be used in India? So the Ghana study, if we see that the factors associated with transition at certain stages are different from other factors, there's a need to think about segmentation of the target customer. Now we say, okay, we have a bunch of people and we want to promote LPG. So this is the message out. But the question is, and I think this is something which in this paper we try to really show, is that the messaging, the incentives, the schemes that you would like to give to someone who has no LPG and you want to move them to primary is very different from someone who is already at primary and you want them to move to exclusive. So this segmented intervention is something that has never been done in the clean cooking space at any scale. And this is something that from the Ghana experience, I would really like to see if in India there is an appetite for such studies and you can do that. Also, you have to understand that many of these countries have no subsidy at all. So, if India wants to move to a no subsidy regime even for the poorest of the poor, how does it impact demand? Growth is something that India can learn from those countries. So I think both sides have a lot to learn from each other. Especially countries in sub-Saharan Africa can have a wealth of understanding and knowledge from India, because India already went through that grind when they wanted to scale it up, to 10 crore PMUA customers. And that time India increased its supply chain by its bottling capacity increased, its the distributor network significantly increased. All these factors, they all come together. It is not just you just hand out LPG cylinders. It's there's a lot of back end, front end, and the digital infrastructure which kind of all fit in well. So if you have to emulate the Indian example in some places in sub-Saharan Africa, where there is at this point almost no network in the rural areas or peri-urban areas, you need to understand these nuances of the Indian system before you jump in.
Great, wonderful. I mean, I could talk to you all day, but this is so great. Really appreciate your time, Abhishek. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the India Energy Hour. Subscribe to this channel to never miss an update. To drop us a feedback, visit our website or write to us at theindiaenergyhour@gmail.com. We are on Twitter. You can follow at TIEH_podcast and get in touch with the two hosts at Shreya_J and at Sandeep Pai.